Chapter 1. The Myth of the Perfect Tongue. Singapore loves to tell a very clean story about itself. A small island, no natural resources, just discipline, education, and language, especially language. English for the world, Mandarin for the future, efficiency, harmony, meritocracy. Repeat until it feels true. This is where the trap begins. Mandarin in Singapore is marketed as a strategic asset, a golden bridge to China, a cultural anchor, a competitive edge in Asia. Parents are told their children will thank them later, preferably in flawless Putonghua, with exam-approved tones and zero personality. But here's the quiet problem nobody likes to say out loud. Mandarin, as enforced in Singapore, is not a living language. It is a policy artifact. It is Mandarin stripped of regional texture, stripped of humour, stripped of rebellion. A language optimised for exams, government announcements, and PowerPoint diplomacy. Great for reciting model essays. Terrible for negotiating reality. Children don't use Mandarin. They perform Mandarin, and performance is expensive. Singapore didn't preserve Mandarin. It standardized it, sterilized it, and locked it inside an education system obsessed with rankings and rubrics. The result is a population fluent on paper and awkward in practice. Speak Mandarin to pass. Switch to English to think. Switch back when elders are watching. This creates a strange linguistic schizophrenia. No language feels fully owned. English becomes transactional. Mandarin becomes ceremonial. Singlish becomes forbidden knowledge, whispered like contraband. Creativity suffocates somewhere in between, buried under correctness. The state insists this is efficiency. Reality calls it cognitive friction. Now let's address the elephant politely sitting in the room pretending not to breathe. China does not reward Singapore for speaking Mandarin. China rewards leverage, scale, and political usefulness. A Singaporean speaking perfect Mandarin is not closer to China. They are closer to being replaceable. Mainland firms do not look at Singapore and say, "Ah yes, our Mandarin speaking equals." They say, "cheaper version available locally." So what exactly is the return on this linguistic investment? Years of drilling, tuition fees, family stress, identity suppression, all to produce workers who are neither native Chinese insiders nor fully global innovators, linguistically obedient, economically boxed. Mandarin becomes less a bridge and more a moat. A beautiful one, very tidy, hard to escape. And the cruel joke is this: the more aggressively Mandarin is pushed as destiny, the narrower the future becomes. Because language, when weaponized by policy, stops being a tool and starts being a leash. This chapter is not an attack on Mandarin. Mandarin is not the villain. The villain is the belief that language can substitute for power, creativity, or economic reality. If this already makes you uncomfortable, good. That means the story is working. Before we go further and start breaking the numbers, the incentives, and the quiet damage underneath, do the algorithmic ritual. Subscribe, like, share. Not because you're polite, but because uncomfortable ideas get buried fast, and you don't want this one disappearing quietly like everything else inconvenient. Chapter 2. Meritocracy with an accent test. Singapore's favourite bedtime story goes like this: work hard, speak properly, score well, and the system will reward you. No corruption, no favouritism, just clean numbers and clean grammar. Meritocracy, laminated and framed. Language is where this fantasy quietly rots. Once Mandarin becomes compulsory, not as a skill, but as a moral signal, meritocracy stops being about ability and starts being about compliance. You are no longer evaluated on what you can think, build, or question. You are evaluated on whether you sound correct to the people grading you. Pronunciation becomes destiny. Vocabulary becomes virtue. Accent becomes guilt. This is not a neutral filter. It never was. Children from English-dominant households start with an advantage. Children from dialect-speaking families get punished for history they didn't choose. Then everyone is told the outcome is fair because the exam was standardized, as if standardization magically deletes social context. Meritocracy loves pretending the starting line doesn't exist. Mandarin exams in Singapore do not measure communication. They measure obedience, the correct phrase, the correct tone, the approved metaphor. Deviate, and you are marked wrong, even if your meaning is clearer than the model answer. Creativity becomes risk. Risk becomes stupidity. Stupidity becomes moral failure. Over time, students learn the real lesson: do not express, replicate. This spills directly into the workforce. Employers don't just ask if you speak Mandarin, they ask how you speak it. Business Mandarin, neutral Mandarin, presentable Mandarin. All code for one thing. Do you sound safe? The irony is sharp enough to draw blood. Singapore claims Mandarin gives access to China, but the version taught is the least useful version for real Chinese environments. It's too stiff, too textbook, too sterile. Real Chinese business runs on flexibility, regional nuance, improvisation, and social reading. Things you cannot multiple choice your way into. So what happens? Singaporeans get stuck translating themselves endlessly. Not just linguistically, but culturally. Too Chinese for the West, not Chinese enough for China. Permanently auditioning. Permanently provisional. Meritocracy turns into a sorting machine that quietly favors those who already fit the sound profile. Everyone else is told to try harder, which is polite language for become someone else. And once language becomes a loyalty test, fear enters the classroom. Fear kills curiosity. Curiosity is where innovation lives. This is how a system obsessed with efficiency produces excellent managers and very few original thinkers. The state calls this harmony. The market calls it stagnation. If you feel a little angry right now, good. That means the mask slipped for a second. Do the boring but necessary thing. Like, subscribe, share. Not because it's cute, but because platforms punish long-form discomfort unless it performs. This series doesn't survive on politeness. Chapter 3. The economic cost. Nobody wants to itemize Singapore insists it is pragmatic, cold-eyed, numbers first. So let's be rude and follow the money. For decades, Mandarin has been sold as an investment. Time, tuition, policy bandwidth, cultural pressure, all justified by one promise: economic payoff via China. Here's the problem. The payoff is underwhelming. Despite relentless Mandarin promotion, Singapore's comparative advantage has never come from Chinese language arbitrage. It came from neutrality, legal clarity, financial infrastructure, and English fluency. The moment Mandarin is framed as the core differentiator, Singapore enters a competition it structurally cannot win. Mainland China does not outsource China-facing roles to Singapore because of language. It outsources based on cost, proximity, political alignment, and domestic priorities. Singapore loses on 3 out of 4 without even finishing the sentence. Meanwhile, the domestic cost keeps accumulating. Households pour absurd sums into language tuition, not to gain fluency, but to avoid falling behind. This is defensive spending, not productive investment. Money that could go into skills with actual market elasticity gets burned on accent refinement and exam survivability. At a macro level, this creates a labour force optimised for credential signalling instead of value creation. You get employees who can write immaculate emails in Mandarin about projects they did not design, using frameworks they did not invent, selling products they did not originate. Efficient, polite, replaceable. Worse, Mandarin-heavy strategies quietly crowd out higher return capabilities: advanced analytics, design thinking, deep engineering, cross-cultural negotiation. These require linguistic flexibility, not linguistic rigidity. They thrive in environments where expression beats correctness. Singapore's Mandarin policy unintentionally taxes experimentation. The opportunity cost is brutal. Every hour spent perfecting a standardized phrase is an hour not spent building something weird, risky, or original. In a global economy that rewards novelty, this is not discipline, it's self-handicapping. And let's puncture the last illusion. Multinational firms do not pay a premium for Mandarin-speaking Singaporeans. They pay a premium for people who can operate across ambiguity. If Mandarin is needed, they hire mainland talent directly. Cheaper, native, no cultural lag. So who benefits? The education industry, the testing ecosystem, the narrative, not productivity, not wages, not long-term resilience. Singapore as a country ends up subsidizing a linguistic arms race that delivers diminishing returns while pretending the curve is still going up. This is not anti-Mandarin. This is anti-delusion. If language was destiny, the world would already be fair. It isn't. Do the algorithm dance again? Like, subscribe, share. Not because you love this, but because pretending everything is fine is expensive and someone has to say it out loud. Chapter 4. When Language Eats Identity. Singapore likes to say identity is flexible, multicultural, modular. You can swap languages depending on context, like outfits. Morning English, afternoon Mandarin. Singlish nowhere official, everything tidy. This sounds progressive until you watch what it actually does to people. When a language is imposed not as expression but as obligation, it stops being cultural and starts being disciplinary. Mandarin in Singapore becomes less about heritage and more about correctness. Not who you are, but whether you pass inspection. Children learn early that some versions of themselves are acceptable and others are not. Your home language is noise. Your dialect is backward. Your humor is incorrect. Your instincts need editing, so they self-edit, constantly. This produces a population fluent in self-censorship, not just linguistically, but emotionally. Say the safe thing, use the approved phrase, avoid sounding too much like anything real. Authenticity becomes a liability. The state calls this social cohesion. Psychology calls it fragmentation. People who don't fully belong to any linguistic space compensate by clinging harder to status markers, credentials, brands, titles. That's how hollow identity turns into brittle pride, the kind that shatters when challenged. Singlish, the only language that actually reflects lived Singaporean reality, is treated like a disease. Useful at home, embarrassing outside, officially discouraged, unofficially unavoidable. A linguistic ghost that everyone uses and nobody is allowed to respect. This creates a strange cultural vacuum. You can speak but not mean. You can communicate but not connect. Conversations become efficient and emotionally thin. Conflict is avoided, not resolved. Depth is replaced with procedure. And here's the quiet danger. Societies with thin cultural cores don't bend well under stress. They crack. They become defensive. They mistake uniformity for unity and obedience for trust. When external pressure rises, there's nothing elastic inside to absorb it. Mandarin, forced into this role, becomes a scapegoat. People don't resent the language itself. They resent what it represents. Control disguised as opportunity, conformity sold as advantage. This resentment doesn't explode loudly. It leaks into cynicism, into disengagement, into the subtle refusal to care deeply about anything that feels state-managed. You end up with a society that works extremely well and believes in very little. That is not stability. That is suspended animation. Do the required ritual again, like, subscribe, share. Not because it feels good, but because systems that hollow people out depend on silence to stay respectable. Chapter 5 will close this arc by asking the forbidden question: what happens if Singapore's language strategy stops looking like strength and starts looking like strategic misalignment? Chapter 5. When strategy turns into muscle memory. Singapore's language policy still runs on momentum, not evidence, not recalibration, momentum. The kind where nobody wants to be the first adult in the room to say, this worked once, but the world moved. Mandarin is no longer a strategic bet. It's muscle memory. The original logic made sense decades ago. Hedge against the West, align culturally with a rising China, signal regional relevance. But strategies age. When they don't get updated, they stop being strategies and start being rituals. Here's the uncomfortable part. China no longer needs Singapore as a linguistic intermediary. Global capital no longer needs Mandarin to access Asia. Innovation no longer clusters around linguistic purity. What matters now is adaptability, narrative control, creative leverage, the ability to move between systems without needing permission. Singapore's Mandarin push, frozen in an earlier era, optimizes for none of that. Instead, it produces predictability, predictable graduates, predictable managers, predictable thinking. In a world where unpredictability is where value hides, this is not safety, it's exposure. And the risk is not just economic, it's reputational. When language policy becomes visibly disconnected from outcomes, faith erodes. People stop believing the system is smart. They start believing it is stubborn. That is a dangerous transition. Systems survive incompetence longer than they survive disbelief. You already see the symptoms. Quiet disengagement. Overqualified talent hedging exits. Young professionals fluent in 3 languages and loyal to none of them. People who comply but no longer internalize the story. Singapore still works. That's the problem. It works just well enough to delay reform, just smoothly enough to mask drift. But alignment decay is not loud. It's silent until it isn't. Mandarin does not need to be removed. It needs to be demoted. From destiny to tool, from identity marker to optional leverage, from moral requirement to contextual skill. Until that happens, Singapore will keep mistaking linguistic discipline for strategic foresight, and the bill will keep coming due in ways that don't show up neatly on GDP charts. This was never about hating a language. It was about refusing to worship it. If this series irritated you, unsettled you, or made you mentally argue back, good. That means you're still thinking instead of reciting. Now do the unglamorous thing one last time. Like, subscribe, share. Not as loyalty, but as signal. Long-form critique survives only when people actively keep it alive. This arc is complete. The next one goes deeper, and fewer people will like it.